The year is 793 AD, and you're a monk chilling at Lindisfarne Monastery off the coast of England, probably copying some manuscript about why premarital sex sends you to hell. When suddenly a bunch of tall Scandinavian guys with axes show up in boats shaped like dragons. Spoiler alert, they're not here for your theological debate club. They're here to kill you, steal your shit, and maybe set your church on fire for fun. Welcome to the Viking Age, where Europe's worst weekend lasted about 3 centuries, and fundamentally changed the continent's entire political landscape. Because some Norwegian farmers discovered that coastal raiding had better profit margins than turnip cultivation. So let's be clear about what Vikings actually were, because Marvel has lied to you. These weren't mystical warriors chosen by gods to do heroic battle. They were early medieval venture capitalists who realized that monasteries were basically unguarded Amazon warehouses full of gold chalices and zero security systems. The word Viking wasn't even an ethnicity. It was a job description, a verb, something you did. I'm going Viking this summer meant I'm taking my gap year to commit aggravated robbery across international waters. Most Scandinavians were just farmers and fishermen living relatively boring lives. But some entrepreneurial dickheads looked at their shitty farmland that produced 3 potatoes and a sense of seasonal depression, then looked at their boats, then looked at a map of every undefended coastal town in Europe and thought, I've identified a market inefficiency. The Vikings didn't invent naval warfare or even piracy. They just perfected the business model by combining superior shipbuilding technology with an absolute lack of moral qualms about burning monasteries full of screaming monks. Here's where Vikings actually innovated. Their boats were genuinely fucking incredible. The longship was basically the stealth bomber of the 9th century, able to navigate both open ocean and rivers only 3 feet deep, meaning Vikings could sail up basically any waterway in Europe and appear where no one expected seaborne raiders to physically be able to reach. These ships were clinker-built, with overlapping planks that made them flexible enough to handle ocean waves, but light enough that the crew could literally pick up the boat and carry it over land if they encountered a waterfall or felt like raiding a town on the other side of a peninsula. The dragonhead prow wasn't just decorative intimidation, it was psychological warfare designed to make coastal villagers shit themselves before the actual murdering started. And because longships had such a shallow draft, Vikings would just beach them directly on shore, jump out swinging axes, do their pillaging, and be back in the boat heading home before any actual military response could arrive. It was the medieval equivalent of a smash and grab robbery, except instead of grabbing jewelry from a mall kiosk, they were grabbing literally everything from your entire village, including your grandmother's earrings and possibly your grandmother. That raid on Lindisfarne in 793 wasn't the first Viking raid ever, but it was the one that made everyone in Europe realize, oh fuck, this is gonna be a recurring problem. Lindisfarne was one of the holiest sites in England, a monastery founded by Celtic saints, home to gorgeously illuminated manuscripts, and enough religious gold to make a megachurch pastor weep with envy. The Vikings showed up on June 8th, killed a bunch of monks who had literally taken vows of pacifism and therefore couldn't fight back, stole everything that wasn't nailed down, and some stuff that was, then left. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle described it as the worst thing to happen to Britain since the Romans left. Which tracks, because having your sacred religious sites plundered by pagans who don't give a shit about your god tends to be traumatizing. What made it worse was that monasteries were specifically built in remote coastal locations for spiritual isolation and meditation, which accidentally made them perfect Viking targets. Isolated, wealthy, undefended, and right on the water. It's like if you built a bank vault on a beach and staffed it entirely with pacifist poets. One scholar at the time literally wrote, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain," which is basically a Yelp review saying 0 stars, would not recommend being raided by Vikings. After Lindisfarne proved the concept, Viking raiding became Scandinavia's hottest export industry. Norwegian Vikings went west, hitting Ireland, Scotland, and eventually Iceland, because apparently they looked at a volcanic rock in the North Atlantic and thought, I could farm here. Danish Vikings went south, terrorizing England and France so effectively that the French king eventually just gave them a chunk of France called Normandy in exchange for them maybe calming the fuck down. Their descendants later conquered England anyway, because Vikings were big on long-term strategic planning when it came to taking other people's shit. Swedish Vikings went east, navigating Russian river systems all the way to Constantinople, where they became the Byzantine emperor's personal bodyguards. Because the Byzantines figured if you can't beat the Vikings, you might as well hire them to beat everyone else. The Vikings hit Spain and got their asses kicked by the Moors, which tracks because the Moors actually had an organized military instead of just terrified monks with prayer books. They even made it to North America around 1000 AD, looked at Newfoundland, decided it was too full of hostile indigenous people who fought back, and went home. Which is possibly the only time in history Vikings were like, you know what, this conquest thing seems difficult. Never mind. By 865, Vikings stopped being content with seasonal hit-and-run raids and decided to try full-scale invasion, because apparently regular armed robbery wasn't stimulating enough anymore. The Great Heathen Army, which is what the Anglo-Saxons called it, and yes, that's the actual historical name, was a massive coalition of Viking warriors who landed in England with the express purpose of conquering kingdoms rather than just robbing them. Led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, who may or may not have been a real person, historians argue about this shit constantly, this army systematically conquered 3 of the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia all fell like dominoes made of incompetent English kings who hadn't invested in naval defense. The only kingdom that survived was Wessex under Alfred the Great, and even he had to hide in a swamp at one point while Vikings literally occupied his capital. The Vikings introduced England to the concept of Danelaw, which was basically a protection racket scaled up to cover half a country. Nice kingdom you've got here. Be a shame if someone burned it. How about you let us rule everything north of this line and we won't kill everybody? It was extortion with better PR. While Alfred was busy being great and eventually pushing Vikings back in England, the Franks tried a different strategy that I can only describe as negotiating with terrorists medieval edition. Charles the Simple, yes, really, that's what history calls him, nominative determinism is real, started paying Vikings protection money called Danegeld, which is Old English for please don't murder us, here's a fuck ton of silver. This worked exactly as well as you'd expect, which is to say it didn't work at all. Because once you establish that you'll pay raiders to go away, every Viking in Scandinavia now knows you're the medieval equivalent of a loot piñata. The payments got bigger and bigger, draining royal treasuries to pay off raiders who would just take the money, leave for winter, then come back next spring like, hey, remember that protection money? Yeah, we're gonna need more of that. At one point, England was paying literally tons of silver annually to Vikings, which funded the Viking economy so effectively that you can trace Scandinavian economic development directly to English taxpayers getting extorted. One English king paid 48,000 pounds of silver in a single payment, which in today's money is still a fuckload of silver. The poet Rudyard Kipling later wrote, once you have paid him the Danegeld, you never get rid of the Dane, which is surprisingly good economic analysis from a guy known for racist poems about colonialism. In 845, a Viking chieftain named Ragnar, possibly the same Ragnar, possibly a different Ragnar, Vikings reuse names like Apple reuses iPhone designs, sailed up the Seine River with 120 ships and 5,000 men to besiege Paris. Paris at this time wasn't the romantic city of lights. It was a fortified island in a river which Vikings looked at and thought, I bet we can fuck that up. The Frankish king Charles the Bald, these medieval nicknames are killing me, tried to fight them off, failed miserably, and ended up paying 7,000 pounds of silver to make them leave. 40 years later, Vikings came back in 885 for a sequel siege that lasted almost a year, because apparently the first movie made enough money to justify a franchise. This time, Paris held out better, thanks to a count named Odo who actually knew how to defend a fortification. But the siege only ended when the Frankish emperor paid the Vikings again and gave them permission to sail up the river to go raid Burgundy instead. It's the medieval equivalent of paying someone to rob your neighbor, which is technically problem solving, but also makes you a dick. These repeated Viking raids on Paris demonstrated that even major European cities weren't safe from dudes in boats with axes, which must have been a real morale killer for everyone who thought city walls meant something. Here's where the story gets weird. Vikings weren't just raiders, they were also colonizers who actually settled down and started farming in places they'd previously been burning to the ground. The Danelaw in England became a permanent Viking settlement zone where Norse culture mixed with Anglo-Saxon culture, giving us place names ending in by and thorp that still exist today. Vikings founded Dublin as a trading post, which is ironic because Ireland went from being a major center of Christian learning to having a capital city founded by pagans who who initially showed up to steal church gold. In Normandy, those settled Vikings became French so effectively that within a few generations they forgot how to speak Norse, converted to Christianity, and started acting indistinguishable from Frankish nobles, which is either impressive cultural integration or a complete betrayal of their heritage depending on who you ask. The Viking settlement of Iceland created the world's oldest continuous parliament, the Althing, which means Vikings literally invented parliamentary democracy while simultaneously raiding monasteries, because they contained multitudes. Even in Russia, Swedish Vikings called the Rus established trading routes and founded the state that would eventually become Russia, which means Putin can trace his country's origins back to Swedish raiders, which I'm sure thrills him. Turns out the same people who were really good at organized violence were also pretty good at organized government, because apparently authoritarianism transfers well across job descriptions. Eventually, Europe solved the Viking problem through a strategy that can only be described as, if you can't beat them, convert them. Throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, Scandinavian kings started converting to Christianity, partly because it gave them legitimacy in European politics, and partly because Christian kings got to participate in the continental trade networks that were closed to pagan raiders. Once you're a Christian, you can't really raid other Christian monasteries without looking like a hypocrite, which cut into the traditional Viking business model significantly. The Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason converted around 995, and then spent his reign converting Norway by the extremely persuasive method of become Christian or I'll kill you, which is technically evangelism, but definitely not what Jesus had in mind. Denmark's herald Bluetooth. Yes, the Bluetooth technology is named after a Viking king because he united Denmark like the technology unites devices. Branding teams love this shit. Converted in the 960s and raised a runestone about it, which is the medieval equivalent of posting about your religious conversion on Instagram. By the time William the Conqueror, a descendant of Vikings who'd settled in Normandy, conquered England in 1066, Vikings had basically become just another group of European Christians fighting other European Christians over land rights and succession disputes. The Viking Age officially ended not with some epic final battle, but with gradual cultural assimilation and religious conversion, which is way less dramatic than Thor would have wanted, but is how most historical eras actually end. So what did 3 centuries of Viking raids actually accomplish, besides traumatizing every monk in Europe and redistributing massive amounts of silver from Christian treasuries to Scandinavian economies? Well, they fundamentally restructured European political boundaries, created new trade networks connecting Scandinavia to the Mediterranean and the Middle East, founded cities that still exist today, established kingdoms in England and Russia, discovered North America 500 years before Columbus, though they didn't stick around long enough to fuck it up like he did. And generally proved that if you're really good at boats and violence, you can terrorize an entire continent for generations. The Viking Age also demonstrated that the same people could be both brutal raiders and sophisticated traders, pagan berserkers and parliamentary democrats, uncivilized barbarians and skilled craftsmen who produced intricate jewelry and poetry about their feelings. Modern pop culture has turned Vikings into noble warriors fighting for honor and glory, which is hilarious considering they were mostly just really good at organized theft on an industrial scale. Were they brave? Absolutely. Were they skilled navigators and warriors? Undeniably. Were they also murderous pirates who burned churches full of terrified clergy and extorted entire kingdoms through systematic violence? Yes, also that. History contains multitudes, and the Vikings contained probably more multitudes than most, which is why we're still making TV shows about them 1,000 years later instead of about like Frankish agricultural reform or whatever boring shit everyone else was doing in the 9th century.